Okay, so I'm honored to introduce our next guest who, through just our 10-minute phone conversation, I learned so much. So I'm very excited that she agreed to be with us today. Professor Josephine Sorgwe is a clinical supervising attorney at the University of Houston Law Center Immigration Clinic. She has completed her undergraduate studies at the Texas A&M University, where she earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science. After completing her undergraduate studies, she attended the University of Houston Law Center, where she received her JD. At the immigration clinic, she supervises law students on pro bono cases involving crime victims, asylum seekers, and more. Professor Sorgwe also provides direct pro bono legal representation to immigrant victims of crime, domestic violence, and human trafficking under a grant from the Texas Access to Justice Foundation. She has spoken at numerous events regarding deferred action for childhood arrivals, crime victims, naturalization, and more. She is also an active member of the community as she participates in numerous workshops and offers legal advice to community organizers and community members. Professor Sorgwe has always had a passion for people from diverse places and for helping those in need. And she thoroughly enjoys representing each of the clients who walk through the doors of the immigration clinic. Please join me in giving Professor Sorgwe a warm SULC welcome.
And thank you so much for being here with us today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. No, it is a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I was able to speak with Abir and just in exchanging emails with Professor Alan Bell. I'm just honored to be here today and to be able to talk about this issue of immigration and race, because these are two issues that we hear a lot about immigration and we hear a lot about race, but I think we rarely hear about the intersection of the two, which is interesting because the two touch each other quite often in the discussion. And especially, I would say that race impacts immigration in a really, really great way. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. I want to say that we cannot oversimplify the two to say that race only has to do with immigration, immigration only has to do with race. And I think especially that latter statement, no one would agree with. But even immigration is not just about race, it is also about xenophobia. But a large part of it as well has to do with race. And so we're going to be discussing the intersection of those two. I was thinking about the best way to present the intersection of immigration and race, and thought it would be good if I could take us back in history so that we could understand the types of laws that have shaped immigration law to what we have in the current day. And when we do this, you can see how race and national origin, particularly the dominant race of a nation tends to be what the United States has used to decide whether or not this is a group of people that we want in the nation or not. So I want to just to get a quick survey of who's in the room. How many of you have heard anything about immigration in the news recently? Show of hands. Okay. Yeah. How many of you have heard anything as it relates to Black immigrants in the news? Okay, less hands. How many of you have heard something as it relates to immigrants who are of Asian descent? Okay, so, and that's what I thought. So what my talk today is going to be primarily focusing on those two groups. So I'm going to be talking about immigration law as a whole, but primarily focusing in on the impact of Chinese immigrants, especially Chinese immigrants, as well as Japanese and other immigrants of Asian descent. And then at the end, we will discuss the specific effect on Black migrants currently in present day. Is that all right? Okay, so let's go. So at the very beginning, we have the Naturalization Act of 1790. Has anybody heard of the Naturalization Act of 1790? Yeah, no, it's something that no one hears about and no one talks about. I think it's rarely even discussed in history at school. But what it was is the Naturalization Act of 1790 was the first time that the United States defined who it is that becomes a citizen of the United States. what qualifications will we need in order to determine that someone is a citizen of the United States? We have to remember that at this time, 1790, the country is a very, very new country. And as a result of that, the majority of the people who are in the country have not been born in the United States. Fun fact, the first US president, or actually, I'll ask this to you guys. Does anyone know who the first US president who was born on American soil was? Okay, I don't see anybody's hands. Let me know if I'm missing someone's hand that I'm not seeing. But yes, it was actually Martin Van Buren. So feel free to tell people that at parties, let them know that you know the name of the first American president who was actually born in the US. But it was Martin Van Buren, and he was the 8th president of the United States, and he took office in the 1830s. Remember when the nation started, and think that it took that long before there was a president who was born on US soil. So when we're talking about the 1790s being about 40 years prior to when the first US president was actually born on US soil, we are talking about a nation filled up with immigrants, a nation filled with people who are not necessarily born in the United States. And a lot of times we hear that rhetoric of, we are a nation of immigrants, we are a nation of immigrants. And it's true, but I think we have to make sure that when we say that we are a nation of immigrants, we do not forget two very, very important groups and their immigration stories. The first is going to be that of the Native Americans. The Native Americans, they are not immigrants, right? They were here. And it is because of broken promises and failed treaties, and as a result of many different things, that the Native Americans don't have as much of a presence in the United States. Many of whom were slaughtered, really, by the Europeans who entered the country. Not trying to get into to that part of history, but it is a really sad chapter of American history. But Native Americans, they are not immigrants. So when we talk about a nation of immigrants, sometimes we are taking away that narrative, and that's important to note. Another important group to note would be that of Africans who were forced to come to the United States as slaves. Right? And I phrase it that way because a lot of times we just say slaves. These were people who had full identities and lives before they were enslaved. And I don't think that their identity should be reduced slowly to their enslavement. But when they were placed on those ships, they did not have the American dream. Right? They did not have this idea of going to the United States and becoming a better person. They were forced there. And as a result of that, we have to think about that. So there is a migration story, but it's not a beautiful narrative of dreams and love. And because of that, I think when we talk to different groups, we have to keep that in mind, that not everyone buys into the promise of America in the same way. And so when we talk about immigrants, some people say that my ancestors never came with that dream. They were forced here. Or my ancestors, you invaded my ancestors' land. So we have to kind of think of that at the same time. But going back to the Naturalization Act of 1790, we were only allowing free white men who were property owners. White males who were property owners were the only people who were allowed to become citizens of the United States. Currently, we have a system that can take years and years and years, even decades sometimes, for people to become citizens. At that time, do you think it was taking years and years and years for people to become citizens of the United States? Not at all, right? It took 2 years. 2 years. You had to have resided in the United States for 2 years, have someone attest that you are a person of good moral character, and then assure that you were not a convict, and boom, you were a citizen of the United States. That was it. That was the Naturalization Act of 1790. Note that with this first piece of legislation, we see an exclusion of many groups of people already, right from the very beginning. So that's why when I say, when we talk about immigration law, it really is a history of exclusion. If we're talking about the United States. Now, I don't want to be a downer today. I wish I had a lot of really, really fun, great news about immigration, but a lot of the story of immigration in the United States, it's not a positive one. it really is one of restriction. It's one of exclusion. But somehow at the same time, there have been people who've been able to break out and have been able to fulfill this American dream. Former President Barack Obama, always my president, always talks about our more perfect union, that we are forever becoming a more perfect union. And so the history, I've heard people say that the United States, yes, it has a history of exclusion and restriction, but also a history of people who are here who insist that they are a part of this fabric and demand that they be given the full rights and of citizenship of the United States. So that's the Naturalization Act of 1790. Then we move forward into the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Doesn't that sound lovely? That's why I wanted to prep you and say that this is not a beautiful history, okay? The Indian Removal Act. Can anyone guess what the Indian Removal Act was? No wrong answers. Just kind of guess what you think the Indian Removal Act may have been about.
I'm gonna take a wild guess and think it's like about removing the Indians, maybe.
Bingo. Bingo. You're good. Okay. So we're talking about Native Americans. And at the time, of course, the term that they used was Indian. But in 1830, they stated that all Native Americans, then called Indians, were to be removed from the eastern part of the United States and to specific parts of the United States, of the western part of the United States. It was guaranteed, assured, that that land would always remain theirs forever. It literally is in part of the act that this would forever be theirs. That would not be the case, but that is what happened. They said the act also provided for the aid and the assistance of the movement of these people, which essentially was the forced removal of Native Americans to certain parts of the nation. Why do I bring this up? This is yet another instance of deciding who is an American and preventing certain types of people from being in literally even present on the land or having the certain rights and privileges of being an American. All throughout our nation's history, the population of the United States has been changing and shifting. It's never been stagnant. It's always been changing. I think it does a disservice to the history of the United States to act as if we are, maybe a country like Germany, or a country even like France or Nigeria even. Some of these countries that have the majority of the people are people who have lived there since the beginning of, or for hundreds and hundreds of years. We're not talking about a homogenous group like that. Instead, we're talking about a group that the demographics are constantly shifting and constantly changing as a result of what's going on around the world. It's an experiment to put people from all across the world together. That's the United States. But through that experiment, there have been many attempts that were successful, actually, to prevent certain people, even if they were here, from having the full rights and privileges of being a United States citizen. Moving forward in history, so we're at about 1830. When you get to about 1857, we have the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott decision is, without question, one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever. I'm sure you guys are all law students and you've been able to read it. And sometimes we don't think of Dred Scott in terms of immigration, but it does touch immigration, right? Because you were saying that Black people are not afforded freedom or citizenship rights. Again, that's going to this idea of who is an American, who gets to have these rights, who gets to have these privileges. And that decision says that Black people, African Americans, the term used in the decision, would not be afforded those rights. We then go to 1868. That's when we have the 14th Amendment that says citizenship to all those born in the United States. You guys are in law school. You know the 14th Amendment isn't that simple. And it wasn't just a flick of the wand and boom, everyone is a citizen. That is something that is probably one of the most frequently cited amendments in cases, because there's so much that packed in there in terms of the rights for people. But then we have the Naturalization Act of 1870. This specifically, explicitly was to extend naturalization rights to those of African descent, which is good, right? I would love to be able to say that in 1870, all the wrongs were righted and everything was good, but we know that wasn't necessarily the case. Then we have the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Show of hands, who has heard of the Chinese Exclusion Act? Anybody? Okay, just a few. Oh my goodness. Sometimes I want to be a history teacher because I feel like it's not, there are so many things that we don't discuss in history. And this is another one that's really important. 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, it's exactly what it sounds like, excluding Chinese laborers from the United States. It would then be renewed again in 1892, so 10 years later. And it was only repealed in 1943 when the US needed the Chinese to serve as an ally against the Japanese. So that's another sad chapter in the history of the United States. But that's something that I think is important to see, that literally a really important piece of immigration legislation restricting the entrance of certain people on what basis? On the basis of race and ethnicity. In 1892, I mentioned that, so we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we have a comment. I agree that the historical context is extremely important. And that's what I think too, because sometimes I think that we can start to think that what is going on is happening in a vacuum, right? And so some of the ideas that are being tossed around and the thoughts that are coming up, these are all new things, right? No, everything that is happening right now, it's a cycle of what has been before. There's nothing new under the sun. And when you really back out, take a step back and take a macro view of everything, you can really see, oh, so all of these laws when it comes to immigration really do touch these different issues of race, different issues of ethnicity and exclusion. Also note that even though I am, like I said, I'm focusing on immigrants of Asian descent and immigrants of African descent, I want to note that the Europeans of Southern and Eastern descent, they weren't a fan of them either. It was just as time went on in the nation's history, then they said, okay, I guess they can sit with us. But for a long time, even into the 1900s, they were not a favored group of people as well, which is one of the reasons why I say that it's not just immigration law is not just about race, but also has to do with xenophobia, right? So in 1892, there was something called the Geary Act, which required people of Chinese descent to carry a certificate of residence with them at all times. When we think about this, what is this? This is othering people, saying, you look different. Do you belong here? That type of question is a question that has continued throughout history. Most notably, I think, when the then president of the United States was accused of not being from the United States. It's this idea of you don't look like us, therefore you are not one of us. And this was literally written into law at the time, 1892, requiring people of Chinese descent to carry a certificate of residence, whether or not they were born in the United States or not. And then in 1892, there was a case, Fong Yue Ting v. U.S., that upheld that requirement. The United States Supreme Court upheld that requirement and also said that came back with President Obama. Exactly. Yeah. But there was also, in that case, they also stated that you needed at least one credible white witness to prove that a Chinese immigrant was here lawfully. So there was, in that case, it involved in part as someone trying to prove that they were in the United States lawfully. They had brought 3 Chinese immigrants or Chinese people of Chinese descent to testify to their lawful presence in the United States. They said, no, you need at least one white witness in order to be seen here as being lawful here. And all of that was upheld. A case that I think is really important. Have you guys heard about U.S. birthright citizenship? So it's this idea, a couple of nods. So it's this idea that when you are born in the United States, that you become a citizen of the United States. Okay. I see a comment, I'm always disappointed, but no longer surprised. Othering is ingrained in this country's history. It absolutely is. And in this kind of course through history that I'm taking probably amplifies and magnifies that. But birthright citizenship, it's this idea that you're born on the US soil and therefore you then get to be a citizen of the United States. That was not always the case, obviously, in the United States. There were many people prior to that even though they were born in the United States, they were not considered citizens of the United States. And therefore they were not afforded different rights, such as property ownership, voting, the ability to work in some places, the ability to not be enslaved. All of these things were not afforded to them as a result of a lot of times race and ethnicity. So with US v. Wong Kim, this is the case that brought the question of, can the children of immigrant parents be considered US citizens? And the answer was a yes. Okay, so it affirms that a person born in the United States is a citizen by birth, regardless of the race or the parent's status. So you may have heard the former president talking about whether or not US birthright citizenship was actually something that was real, whether that could be something that was challenged, and that's something that is discussed quite often in certain groups. The answer is that it's already really been answered by, literally in 1898, the same people who were making several terrible decisions were at least able to say, you know what, if you were born in the United States, then you are a citizen by birth. Note that this is not necessarily the case all the time. In terms of someone being born in the United States and therefore assuming that citizenship being born in a country and therefore being a citizen of that nation. There are some nations that is not the case, and it is going to be a matter of who your parents are, and it doesn't matter if you were born in the country. So that's not necessarily the case all over the world, but it is something that has been the case for US citizens. And it's funny because that's what they were using, right, to say that people were now US citizens, because if we grandfather that back to say, okay, a person born in the US is not a citizen by birth unless their parents were citizens. If you start taking that back, that means no one is a citizen of the United States, right? But they weren't really kind of thinking about that, because so often throughout the course of immigration history, people come to the United States, and by the next generation, they've forgotten completely whatever the struggle was of their parents and the people before them. So that's US v. Wong Kim, a case that was all about US birthright citizenship. Then we have in 1904, again, the extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act. They still thought that's a good piece of legislation. Let's keep just renewing that. That's one for the books. And then we also have the Immigration Act of 1917. This is something, again, I almost never hear this discussed. This is where there was they also call this the Barred Zone Act. The barred zone was from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, to which no persons of descent from those areas were allowed to enter the United States. Again, that's 1917. I want to bring to your attention that we are in the year 2021. This isn't that long ago. Okay. Then we have the Immigration Act of 1924. This was a quota system based on national origin. They're like, okay, this is the way we're going to do it. We're going to do it so that we'll have this quota system. It'll be based on national origin. And you can guess it favored primarily Western European countries. We fast forward to 1942. We're getting closer to modern day. We have the Executive Order of 1966. And this is where we have the incarceration of Japanese Americans on the West Coast. Just another question. How many of you learned about the internment of Japanese Americans in school, like K through 12? Okay, a couple. Okay, but I will say I did not. I did not. And I remember when I later learned about it, I was like, wait, we talked a lot about the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor, but we didn't talk much about the Japanese then subsequently being incarcerated in what they called assembly centers. Yes, a very short topic, right? Like just a really quick, like, yeah, but let's talk about the Nazis and how they put people in concentration camps when we actually did the same thing. Okay, so that was in 1942. 1943, as I mentioned before, that's the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, but was primarily motivated not because the United States was like, oh, this was a bad thing, but because they knew that they needed to have the Chinese as an ally in moving forward with the war against the Japanese. So I have a comment from Joan. She says, I believe that they did receive reparations, which also reflects on the present day need for reparations for African Americans. Yes. So in the 1980s, they did receive, as a part of a Civil Rights Act in the 1980s, they were able to receive reparations that were dispersed from 1990 to 1993. And there were about 80,000 people who were inmates essentially in those camps that received reparations at that time. So yes, they did receive reparations. Another thing that we probably don't talk about that much, right? Okay, so moving forward to 1944, big case for immigration. This is called Korematsu v. United States. So you have this executive order. This is the executive order that said all of the Japanese Americans on the West Coast were going to have to go to these internment camps. We have a guy named Fred Korematsu. He does not go. He says, no, I don't want to go. And so he challenges this because they said that he violated the order and was arrested and all of that. And he challenged the order. What did the United States do? The United States upheld the executive order. Executive Order 9066, saying it was a military necessity. It was years later that this was overturned, but they did not overturn the piece about being able to potentially do certain things as a result of military necessity. That language then probably is familiar to you. Have you heard about, we're doing this for the national security? Right? That whole idea and concept is not a new one. And it's this idea of using, I would say the idea of national security or military necessity to move forward. And yes, do we have a question? Is it Sherman? Do you have a question? You can feel free to unmute.
I'm not raising my hand.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Does it show that I'm raising my hand?
Well, I saw a hand up earlier and I didn't know if you had a question, so I apologize.
Did anyone else have a question though, potentially? Okay. So we have, as I was saying, with Korematsu v. the United States, they go on to uphold that executive order, saying it's constitutional, it's fine, you can do that as a military necessity. And that too is considered to be one of the worst decisions in US Supreme Court history. Really quickly, so taking us up more presently to modern day, before 1960, about 90% of immigrants came from Europe and Canada. After 1965, and we had the Immigration Act of 1965, think about what was happening around that time. So we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, then we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the climate and the tide is kind of changing at that moment. And then that's when we also have the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. With that, that is one of the first good pieces of like actually decent pieces of immigration law that we have, in which they did away with the quota system. So remember I said in 1924, there was this quota system saying that it was going to be based on national origin. And so there were even people who would lie about their national origin in order to come into the United States, because they knew that then their applications would be deemed to be more favorable. Famously, I don't know if you've heard of Jared Kushner. He is the spouse of Ivanka Trump, who is the daughter of the former president of the United States. His grandfather, their entire family, they were Jewish. They were in Poland, and they took a different name. They took a different assumed name. They changed their country of origin from Poland to Germany, again, going from East to Western Europe to seem more favorable, as well as putting a sponsor who later disavowed them and said that they did not know them. Okay. And I say that not to shame them. I say that to say that those are stories that are very similar to my clients. So a lot of my clients, they are people who are fleeing from fleeing persecution. And sometimes you might have someone who changed a name, not because they're trying to be a bad person. I'm not advocating for that, but I'm saying that there may have been a reason behind that. And we should maybe sometimes look at that. But we're suddenly saying, oh no, when this was something that was commonplace. I want you to know, I have a colleague of mine who she said, who was white, and she said that her I think grandparents or great grandparents walked through into the United States from Canada. That's especially when you go up north, that's a common story that you'll hear of people. This idea of people just walking into the United States, coming into the United States, either just walking in or coming by ship without permission. And so because of that, this idea of criminalizing immigrants who did not have documentation it's a relatively newer idea. In fact, the detention of immigrants, the large-scale detention of immigrants is something that started in the 80s. It's something that is a relatively new phenomenon. But 1965, the tide changes a little bit. I'm not trying to say that I love everything about we call it the INA, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. Not saying I love everything, but that really does mark a change. Finally, good piece of news in immigration, because it does away with those quotas and instead says that we're going to prioritize two things when it comes to immigration law in the United States. The first being family reunification, so the idea of keeping families together, so someone being able to petition for a spouse or children or parents, the things of that nature. Then also prioritizing skilled workers. And so with the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, that's really when we see the emergence of family immigration and employment-based immigration, two areas of law that you can specialize in. And I know many people who do. So at that point, then we have about 85% of people coming from Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean. That really was able to change things. And I really quickly, I want you to think in your mind of that image of, you may have seen of people on like Ellis Island, right? In those black and white photos of people. Think about what maybe the adjectives that come to your mind when you think of those people who were all huddled right on a ship trying to come to the United States. Now think about what comes to mind when you think of the so-called caravans, who were people coming into the United States. There's a different way that we talk about those two groups of people, right? So the people in those black and white photos from Ellis Island and things like that, those were people looking for economic opportunity, wanted a better life, wanted to be able to buy into the American dream. This group of people here, they're here to rob, kill, and destroy. Right? That's kind of the different narrative that we have with those two different groups. Why is that? I'll let you think about why that might be, right? So we have the Immigration Nationality Act of 1965, and then we have some different acts as well. For instance, like the Refugee Act of 1980, we have other acts that expand the reasons why immigrants could be deported. Again, always looking and kind of targeting certain groups. And then if we come most recently, one of the worst things that we've had would be the Muslim ban. Right? So that was in 2017. The then president stated clearly that he wanted to exclude Muslims from coming into the country, instituted the Muslim ban, which then prevented, at the beginning, including all foreign nationals, which included lawful permanent residents, that would be green card holders, at a time were actually restricted. I remember going to the airport and seeing people just in a panic at that time, and the Muslim identification cards for current residents, yes. And again, so the reason why I took us back, and I really wanted us to look at what was going on, because we have an idea of what's going on now, but to talk about some of those things, these are all the same things. There's nothing new that we're talking about, this idea of, oh, we want people to be carrying identification cards. We've done that before. Oh, we want to restrict access and who can enter the United States. We've done that before. And so the Muslim ban, unfortunately, was upheld by Trump v. Hawaii. And Sotomayor wrote a dissent that was very strong, stating that this was one of the, that this was very similar to Korematsu, a terrible decision. She stated it so eloquently about her disdain for them upholding it. Subsequently, Joe Biden, the Biden administration, would then state that would no longer be in place, but for many years that was the case. I have a comment here also that they are trying to do that now with vaccinated and non-vaccinated when it comes to travel. Absolutely, that is something. It tends to be this pretextual reason. Oh, these people from these countries, I think it could be bad. Let's restrict them, and then they and even if maybe there may have been somewhat of a necessity at a certain point, they never take it back. How do you know if someone is Muslim? That's a good question. I mean, you really don't, right? But a lot of times what they would do is there would be countries where at least statistics would indicate that this is a predominantly Muslim country. And during the previous administration, there were 13 countries that were banned, six of them being African countries, and many of which had countries with a high number of a large majority of Muslim people, which is, again, very interesting, seeing as there were many people who initially came to the United States as a result of religious persecution. And yet that story is being played up again. So I wanted to pause. That's kind of there with our brief history lesson on U.S. immigration law to see if you guys have any questions. And I actually already see a question. Okay, so did they try to do a ban on those seeking asylum a few years back? So there's a lot there, okay? With asylum, there were many different restrictions on asylum. I don't even have time to go into all of them, but I'll talk about maybe a few of the things that eventually restricted asylum. One of the things was that they lowered the number of refugees that were allowed to come into the United States. So just in case you don't know, there actually is a difference between refugees and asylum seekers. Refugees are those designated by the United Nations, UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. So they have to go through a process. Sometimes it can take up to 2 years to go through that process in whichever country that they are seeking, that they are in, and they come into the United States as a refugee. That is what a refugee is. An asylum seeker is someone who comes to the United States, or while they are in the United States says, I need to seek asylum. So either one of two things will happen. Either they're coming to, they arrive at a port of entry, so that could be at the border or even at an airport, and they state, I would like to file for asylum, or they can just state that they have a fear of going back to their home country. They can state that, or while they're here in the United States, especially within 1 year of them entering the United States, they can then file an application for asylum called the I-589, and which will state that they have a fear either of past persecution in their country or a well-founded fear of persecution in the future. So to specifically go to that question, some of the ways that this was restricted, I thought is under the same umbrella. No, and most people do, right? I think a lot of times we'll get someone saying, hey, I have someone who wants to seek asylum and they're in X country. Well, if they're in that country, then they can't be someone seeking asylum. They have to either be at the border or be here in the United States. But there were many things that restricted. For instance, they restricted the people coming into the United States from the southern border. Suddenly they were ineligible to apply for asylum if you came from this southern border. Why would it just be the southern border? Right? Again, this goes to this relationship with immigration and race, because we didn't restrict from the east, the west, the north, just the south. That was something that we saw. Any other questions, though, before I move specifically into Blackness? Does the UN have a role in U.S. immigration policies? Yes and no. So in 1951. And then subsequently in, I believe, 1967 with the U.S. with the protocols, they did kind of get together and issue certain, you could almost call it like a treaty in terms of, okay, if someone is going to face persecution in their home country, you cannot allow them to go back to that country. So that's why when people start talking about treaties and saying this is a violation of our treaties, there are certain things that we have, since we're signatory to some of these treaties, we are not supposed to return people to their country if they've shown, hey, I will be persecuted, I will be tortured if I go back to my country. So yes, there is that. But in addition, there were things like the MPP program, the Migration Protection Protocol program, also sometimes called as the Remain in Mexico program, which made people seeking asylum from the coming especially from that southern border, they were forced to remain in Mexico. Instead of being allowed to come into the United States, they had to remain in Mexico while things were being processed. And that was a very crazy situation. Hurricane Katrina victims were called refugees in our own country. Incredibly incorrect usage of that term. So as I was going through that history, I know I focused quite a bit on some of the different policies about Chinese people, and then more so on a broader sense, also other people of Asian descent, for instance, like the Japanese. But when we talk about Black people, we usually don't think about immigrants, right? And especially when with this discussion of, let's say, DACA, you don't think, some of you guys have heard of DACA, right? You don't think of, you're not thinking a lot of times of Black students, of Black kids, but this is a group that is often overlooked in this conversation about immigration. So we have many people coming from the Caribbean, from the continent of Africa, and from many other nations who just happen to be Black. There's something that there was called the diversity lottery that enabled about 40% of the people from the diversity lottery are people who have been able, who are from African countries. But note that when we talk about Black migrants, they have two strikes against them, right? So you have xenophobia, just generally, that America has always been a fan of. And then you have anti-Blackness, right? Because people aren't looking at people and saying, oh, this person is from Angola. They see a Black person. And because of that, because of anti-Blackness, Black immigrants are unfortunately have to deal with crime in a way that many of their other immigrant counterparts don't. So immigrants of African descent are more likely to be deported than others as a result of crime. We also have many issues of racial profiling that happen with immigrants from other countries or from African countries. I remember someone from the ABA said that the law creates this system that perpetuates tiered personhood, and this is what we're seeing with many of our immigrants of African descent. I wanted to tell you really quickly a story about one of my clients. I had a client who was from a West African country, and I say that just to kind of to not give many identifying factors, but from a West African country, and was going through a lot of political turmoil. His life was threatened, and so he was forced to flee from his country. He went to South America and traveled up through South America and Central America all the way into Mexico. And when he gets to Mexico, and finally gets to the U.S. border, it's like, yay, I'm finally here, right? No. At that point, the U.S. government was doing something called metering, and metering is that they would. Have you been to a meat market and they give you a number and they say, okay, when we call your number, then you can come up? Y'all seen that? Okay, that's what metering is basically. That's what the U.S. government was doing at the border. So they were giving people numbers, and they were saying, okay, we have too many people that we're processing. Here's a number, and when we call your number, then you can go through. This was not just a few days. People were having to stay there for months. But remember, my client is from West Africa. He does not speak Spanish. He is Black. As a result of that, he is a target for many people, and there are immigrant groups who estimate that there are thousands and thousands of Black migrants who are in Mexico as a result of that Remain in Mexico program, and are having to face all sorts of issues that people face in Mexico as a result of being immigrants. But then on top of that, have to face the fact that they are Black in a country that does not necessarily love Black people, where anti-Blackness is prevalent. So my client was with some other West Africans in this. It was this home that was set up for them, and it was not good. One of the people in that home ended up contracting a very serious infectious disease, subsequently died, and as a result of that, they decided to have all of those people come to. They said, okay, call all of those people, even though it wasn't their time, come into the United States. And so at that point, there are so many people who think, okay, so I've been through all these issues and all these problems in my home country. And then 2, I had all of these issues coming to the United States, because coming to the United States, it's a treacherous journey for many people, especially if you are traveling by foot, by train, by car, different things like that. It's a very dangerous journey, and especially being Black to making this journey, it's very, very difficult. And so you go through all of that, and you're thinking, though, but when I get to the United States, though, I will be safe. I will be safe. I will find this reprieve. And that's not what happens. That's not what happens. Instead, what happened to my client, he goes to the border, presents himself again because he presented himself before, and they immediately detain him, because that's what we typically do with people who are seeking asylum. When they come to the border, he's immediately detained. He finally gets his interview with an asylum officer. And the asylum officer says, because between the time that he first tried to come into the United States and when he actually was able to come, there was this ban that they called it the third country asylum ban. So if you had passed through a third country before coming into the United States, then you would not be eligible for asylum. Again, that's why I said there were many ways in which they tried to restrict asylum. And they said it was after a certain date. Okay, like it was like July 2019. My client had entered before July 2019, but they decided to use the date that he came in that second time as the date. As a result of that, what does that mean? That means he's no longer eligible for asylum. He's a kid. He was about 21 years old. He didn't know how to articulate, hey, I originally came before July. It's because of you guys that I wasn't able to enter, and you forced me to take a number and stay in Mexico. And then I was finally able to go. He wasn't able to articulate that. So at this time, he was detained near the border, and then was subsequently transferred to the Houston area. And that's when we at the University of Houston, we were able to get involved with his case. And so I'm going to the detention facility and I'm visiting him, and I get all the details of his story and see that if he gets sent back to his country, he's going to die. Like he's going to die. And even if for some reason the threat that he thought wasn't that real, the fact that he had tried to seek asylum in the United States and then came back, that's the type of thing that in his country would get him immediately killed. So I have this information, and we're trying our best. We're filing all sorts of things, trying to get, they have all these things called like credible fear interviews. Again, I won't get into all of the technicalities of it, but try to get him another credible fear interview, get him before an immigration judge again, and they're just roadblocks. They're saying no. And so at a certain point, they say, he's at the end of his rope. We're going to deport him. And at that point, we file a writ of mandamus in federal court, and asking it was a habeas, and to say that he needed to be before a judge, and to be able to see, first of all, why was he being held? That's a question. And then also to discuss these other issues that needed to be discussed. And between this time that we're filing the mandamus and all of this, they actually book his flight. And so his flight is scheduled for the Wednesday of a week. And we then get a hearing before the federal court judge on that Monday. And so you can imagine how it's Monday, you have your hearing. If this doesn't go well, my client's getting deported on Wednesday. So we have the hearing, and on Tuesday, they issue the stay. And our client was able to stay. I would have had a panic attack. Oh man. It was just so much. And during that time, I'd really gotten to know our client, just a sweet, sweet guy. And it was like, oh my goodness. Like I said, I truly, like he's not going to make it if he has to go back. But he was able to, they issued a stay pending. There was a Supreme Court case that was going to be ruled on later in the summer. And that there were some analogous issues. We said, you need to wait until that case before you make a decision on this. The judge agreed. So the stay was issued. They later then were able to see the wrong in the policy, that anyone who entered during that time, that it was not just my client, there were many people that they were saying, oh, you entered after that date and therefore you are no longer eligible for asylum. There's a whole class of people. There was a lawsuit and they were able to win. And so his case was able to be reconsidered, and we were able to subsequently get him out on parole. So he's currently on the East Coast, where he has family. We were able to send him over there because that's where he had family. Also, the East Coast is a lot more favorable than Texas. I'm in Texas, by the way, when it comes to immigration. So yeah, that was a case, and that was.
So I have a question for you concerning the housing along this journey. So I know you said that he's literally detained. Can you talk to us a little bit about what those conditions would be like for that person who enters this country? And I know we're not calling it prison, but can you help us see the picture? And is there a difference between that detainment and prison itself?
No. The short answer is no. Very good question. No, there really isn't a difference between, and it was funny because I would sometimes mention, oh, my client is detained. He's at a detention facility. And there's some people, they're like, no, he's in prison. And really because he had on a jumpsuit. He was only allowed to leave to come talk to me, was not allowed to come outside. There was no way that he would be able to just say that he wanted to leave. All of his movement was restricted. When I visited him talking to him through a clear glass. So all of the elements of prison are there. The only thing is that you haven't been charged with a crime. That really is the only thing. And especially for Black immigrants, it's difficult, especially here in Texas, because a lot of the people that you are detained with, they speak Spanish. And so individual cells like a jail, their arrangements varied. There was a time that he was in a place, like in a room with some other people, not as many as maybe that you may have seen on the news, but that was happening. But all of this was happening like in March. What happened March of last year? COVID. So there was someone that already I was concerned about his safety and his health, because he was literally in this room with all these other people. And then someone contracted COVID. And we're now in July of 2021. You have to remember, in March of 2020, someone getting COVID, you're nervous that we're all going to die, right? And so what they did is they placed all of them into solitary confinement at that point, which is why, to our professor's question, it is, yes, very similar. The conditions are very similar to prison. I could only speak with him if I made a phone call to speak with him at a certain time, had to go through security in order to meet with him, and even then met with him through glass, all of that. So the conditions were deplorable, and my client became depressed while he was detained. And like I mentioned, because as a Black migrant, he didn't speak Spanish. A lot of times, a lot of things were only being said in Spanish, and so he was in that way othered in that way as well. So it was a very difficult time. Did you need a translator to speak with my client? No, because he spoke English. My client spoke English. Mm-hmm. Okay. So any other questions?
I'd be interested to hear, do you have stories about people who had this ambition of coming to the United States and realizing that they're not welcome and have to make this difficult decision of, do I try to navigate this hatred, or do I just go back to the hatred I was escaping? Have you seen that? And does that enter into these conversations that you have with these clients?
So yes, I have seen that, at least because this asylum process for some people takes years and years and years. I remember doing a presentation a couple of weeks ago, and there was a young man who's their family went through it in 6 months. And I said, wow, that's almost unheard of. There are people who have been in the system for anywhere from 5, 6, 7, 10 years. And so you can imagine, throughout that time, at a certain point, sometimes people are like, my mom's about to die. You know, like, I want to go and see my mom. And I literally want to maybe risk death to be able to see my mom before she passes. So you'll have sometimes moments like that. I have clients who are part of the LGBTQ community who have been, who face all sorts of persecution here in the United States, even. People of different races who they see how difficult it is. But for the most part, the fear that they have supersedes what is going on here in the United States. So I don't have any examples of my clients who have gone back to the United States, but I can tell you that I do have examples of maybe people that I know personally who were immigrants who decided to go back because things were just so difficult. We do have a question in the chat. Would you say the immigration process is more difficult for people coming from African and Caribbean countries? Absolutely. Absolutely. I remember when I was in law school and my then professor, who's now my colleague, was talking about what is going on in terms of the ability to get a visa, right? Because for the most part, especially when we're talking about countries in Africa, it's difficult to enter without documentation. You have to make that trip that my client made, which is not a trip that many people make, which is going first to maybe some country, let's say in like Central America, and then traveling up. And for a lot of, the brothers and sisters that are below us in geography, if let's say if you're from El Salvador, potentially you could make your way up through like trains and different things like that. You can't just get on like a boat to the United States. That's a very difficult thing to do. So for the most part, the Atlantic Ocean almost serves as a barrier to many people especially of African descent. So they have to get to the United States with a visa. And so what they do, a lot of times it's very difficult to then get a visa in a lot of these countries. And that's just one of the ways that they are then restricted. So yes, we see that it is quite difficult for a lot of immigrants from either from the continent of Africa or from the Caribbean to be able to come into the United States. I always say if the continent of Africa were below Texas, that the United States would have built a wall that rivaled the Great Wall of China years ago, and it would have been seen as completely justifiable. There would be many less groups working to help immigrants, and a lot of people wouldn't care, because a lot of times, unfortunately, when we're talking about Black people, Andre 3000 said it best. I don't remember the exact quote, but why is it throughout the course of history that darker folks seem to suffer most? And that's what we see even when it comes to immigration. Okay, so it's interesting how it was not as restrictive when they brought over Africans as slaves on boats. Yeah. And that to me, it's interesting because something I didn't talk about, of course, when we talk about slavery, also if you talk about Chinese workers who were brought to the United States to help build the Transcontinental Railroad, they had no problems bringing them in at that point. It's just then becomes like, oh no, then they have to kind of deal with the problem that they created, themselves. Okay, any other questions?
I'd like to know, have you seen a lot of instances of this regional history infecting this process? For example, I remember in Louisiana, when we would decide what slaves we wanted, we were careful not to pick the ones from places where there had been warfare. So we would certainly not allow slaves here from Haiti and places where they had engaged in some type of warfare. And then I noticed that in this particular state, we're very resistant to welcoming people still today from those same places. Do you see that regional history, infecting this process everywhere, like as I'm describing here?
Yeah, I would say that, because like I said, I'm currently in Texas, and in Texas, I haven't seen it in that way, but we do see a lot of discrimination against Nigerian immigrants because of perceived threats of fraud. That's something that we see. But in terms of really kind of getting into the nitty gritty and kind of saying, not this, but you're okay, not as much, I would say, at least in Texas. I can't necessarily speak for the rest of the nation, though.
And also, are minority, people of color underrepresented in this field of immigration law?
They are.
And why is that? Why is that as a career that we're not considering this?
Yeah, so I literally did a whole talk about that with a panel of other people, and I think it's a complicated answer, and I will try to say it as quickly as possible. But going back to what I said about there being this complicated history for two specific groups, Native Americans and Black people, people who are the descendants of Africans who were brought to this country as slaves. I think part of being an immigration attorney, you really, sometimes a lot of people have a personal story that either they themselves or their parents or their grandparents, they came to the United States. And so therefore they want to help other people in a similar way. And as someone who is the African descendant of a slave, you don't necessarily have that same warm, fuzzy feeling about it. And so I think it kind of prevents people from really being able to dive in. Like, they'll care about the issue, but not want to devote a life to immigration law. So yes, we don't see many Black people in immigration law, and the Black people who are in immigration law, they typically either are African immigrants themselves or like the recent descendants of African immigrants. Okay. Well, I know we're over time now. And are there any other questions?
Any other questions? Any other questions for our speaker before we conclude?
I have one
does?
question.
Okay, sure.
When we were talking about having more people of color, specifically Black attorneys, do immigration, I noticed I hate to say it, but on Twitter, there's a lot of discourse about Black attorneys who only take certain types of jobs because we have a lot of student loan debt. And we need to take care of that. You have big law, people go towards big law. You're starting out now at $200,000 for incoming associates. And I think it's like you mentioned, we have an interest, but it's also that self-preservation, that vested interest in ourselves as well. And I think it goes past immigration. I guess it goes more towards fixing the whole system in general. Yeah. If we're given that opportunity to study law or to study whatever without that burden of financial hardship, I feel as if we would see more Black and brown people, because it does affect us in ways that we don't even recognize. And I think that might be a very big reason that kind of coincides. We're going hundreds of thousands of dollars into debt. If I can get that in my first year as an associate, why would we go towards those practice areas that are necessities and very much needed, but don't necessarily, or what people consider don't necessarily pay as well or give out that financial stability?
Yeah, a very, very, very good question. A question that I've heard before, and I think it's important to note that very, very deep concern, and something that's very real. I think a lot of times as Black people, we are not necessarily, I don't necessarily speak for the entire race, but I will say at least there's a decent portion of Black law students and subsequently Black attorneys who don't necessarily come from money, right? And so it's not necessarily their law school education wasn't funded by mom or by dad. And as a result of that question about loans is a very real question. I literally just had lunch with one of my friends who's a partner now at Locklord, and she graduated the same year as me. And I'm like, oh, wow, you make a lot of money. she makes a lot of money. And so I completely understand the feeling of, look, I need to pay for my loans. I need to support my family because maybe I'm the only person who has the ability to make large amounts of money, and I need to fund, maybe my parents don't have a retirement plan, or I have a brother who is disabled and needs assistance. And so I'm not trying to say if that's the case for someone that you should go another route. I know people who maybe sometimes they start in big law and then they make their way back into nonprofit. Sometimes that's the way people will do it. Or there are programs like the Public Interest Service Loan Forgiveness Program. I know I'm a part of that, where after a certain number of years of working, your loans are going to be forgiven. And on top of that, I'm also through the University of Houston, because we're under a certain grant, I'm able to receive funds that actually pay for my loans. So, and it's for the same amount of time as the Public Interest Loan Forgiveness Program. So in theory, if you stay with under that same grant and then stay with the Public Interest Loan Forgiveness Program, you would have never paid your loans. So there are sometimes some things that you can look into that could maybe be able to support a dream that you have. I was just seeing that, I think it was someone who was a part of the Jenna 6, that he just graduated from law school and is now serving as a fellowship in a clinic at Georgetown for indigent defense. So you can think about someone like that. Yeah. Right.
And you're talking about Theo Shaw, and what's interesting about that is I tried so hard to get Theo to come to Southern University Law Center, and Theo said under no circumstances will I have a law degree that says Louisiana after what had happened to him with Gina 6, but he's doing remarkably well, and he was actually a guest speaker at the law school maybe about 3 years ago.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, he is a definite joy to be around and to watch his career catapult. He's going to make a big impact on this world. Yeah. I'm thinking about this, and I am wondering if some of this has to do with the fact that survival for Black folks and people of color happens to be so paralyzing that when you get through the day, I have not been killed today. Nobody in my family has been killed. Our lights are not off. The children didn't get suspended or expelled from school. When you survive that every day, you don't really have a space on your radar to think about people's struggle out of the country. Your struggle is about survival, immediate survival, and everybody around you is struggling to survive. So you don't often look up and think about what would be happening to people in other places. And then when you do, you realize that the struggle for Black freedom it's universal, right? The oppression of Black bodies and people of color, it is universal. But I think that somehow law school fails to introduce us to this universal reality of people of color. And so we operate just looking at what we can see day to day. But I think when we understand the struggle is broader and it's a human rights struggle, and that we're wedded to all of these same conversations that are happening, we get more involved in this. So I'm so grateful for what you have done today, because you beautifully synthesize all of this history. I mean, this was a lot. And you were able to condense it down effectively, but I think you also made this so real and so tangible for us to understand that we have a place and a duty and an obligation, and it was impressive to listen to you today. So I thank you very much for your obvious research and scholarship, and for your time and commitment to helping the students of the Southern University Law Center. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was, like I said, just a pleasure to be with you guys. And I want you to know, I know there was a lot of unfortunate parts of this, but I do see it's this idea of making this country a more perfect union, and more people who are in the fight gets us closer and closer to that mark. So there are, when I get to see, for instance, when a client like that gets released from parole, or someone becomes a United States citizen and then immediately registers to vote, it makes it all worthwhile. So.
Isn't that beautiful? Make sure you notice the chat before you depart, and I'm going to send you an email after. I thank you a lot.